Gorman, and she's going to come up here and have a chat to you about who gets to control the future use of space and what lessons can be learned from our terrestrial past. Please welcome her to the stage.
Hi everyone, very exciting to be here at Hybrid World. Well, I want to start by showing you this very, very famous image. This is the image of the whole Earth that's come to be known as the Blue Marble. It was taken in 1972 as the Apollo 17 astronauts were returning to Earth. And there were a number of other iconic images of the Earth from the outside, like the famous Earthrise, that in the 60s and 70s really had a profound impact on how people thought about the Earth. So they were integral in spurring the growth of the environmental movement, the idea of Spaceship Earth, the idea that we're in this little sealed capsule that's very fragile, sailing through space. These images were an inspiration for James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis's Gaia hypothesis, the idea that the Earth is a single interconnected system. So this image has had a profound effect on how we think about the Earth. Taken 46 years ago in 1972. Now I want to show you another picture taken in February this year. This is a picture of a red sports car that was launched into space by SpaceX. And at the time, it caused a lot of excitement. People they loved the playfulness of it. They loved the fact it had a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Don't Panic sign on the dashboard. They loved the spacesuit with the dummy inside, driving the car. But this image is so different to the one we just saw. The blue marble image focuses on the Earth. The Earth fills the screen. We're not aware that there is an astronaut in a spaceship outside the image taking the picture. And it gives us a sense, it naturalizes that idea of the Earth as that organic, fragile ball. In this image, the Earth is just the wallpaper, the background. It's just the thing that happens to be there. This spacecraft is moving away from the Earth, and we're outside that frame, kind of being invited to look in and continue this journey. I've been thinking about this image a lot because it is so radically different to all of those previous views of the Earth from outside that we've had. And of course, as many people commented at the time, this isn't about showing us Earth. This is actually a demonstration of this new period of space enterprise that we're in, the kind of space which is being driven by private corporations. So, I'm an archaeologist. Something that we do is look at the deep human past and we divide it up into segments so that we can understand it a bit more easily. So people have probably heard of the ages of the past, Iron Age, Bronze Age, Stone Age, not a term we use much anymore. And of course, many would say we're now living in the space age. Well, we are living in the space age. But as an archaeologist, I'm interested in how we might break this big age up into smaller segments in order to understand it. And a scheme that I particularly like is one put forward by space power theorists Peter Hayes and Charles Lutz. And in their theory of space power, they argue that the period from 1957, when Sputnik 1, the first satellite, was launched into Earth orbit, until 1991, was the first period of space. And this is essentially, we're looking at the Cold War, we're looking at massive competition between those superpowers. But they're not interested in the technology or the politics that creates this as a segment. They're interested in the commodity that is purveyed by this period of the space age. And they argue that the commodity that is the centre of space exploration throughout the Cold War is prestige, national prestige usually. So this is what's at stake. This is why people are driven to do all of these space things. 1991, generally held to be the end of the Cold War. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Soviet Union starts to break up. So the next period of space is that the commodity that is centered in it is information. So this is where we start to get used to the idea that we're connected to the world. We have all of our geostationary telecommunication satellites enabling us to be connected to television, telephone, all across the world. The information superhighway, the internet, everything. So information is the key commodity here. What they also argue is that and this is a theory that they published 10 years ago now, that they said we are on the cusp of a new age in space, and the commodity that is being purveyed is wealth. So I want to look at a couple of examples of how this new space age might be played out. So we're going to go from this particular theory of space power to an example that lots and lots of people use to compare to what might be happening now that private corporations are playing a much bigger role in space. And the analogy is with the growth of railroads, particularly in the US. There's a bunch of stuff going on here. One that is there's a concept of the frontier, and this is a metaphor that's used in space all the time. They're building railroads to cross the continent, to open up new markets, and to promote settlement. But how these railroads worked were actually a combination of private and public money. So this is why people think this is a really good analogy for what's going on now. And some of the interesting lessons that we might draw from this are, first of all, it's true, these railroads opened up these vast areas. People could now ship their agricultural produce to the major city centres. It enabled people to go and live in parts of the US that had been difficult to live in before. But they had to entice the private investors to actually build the infrastructure first. So there was very, very high cost of developing that infrastructure, which is fairly similar to space industries as well. One of the ways they did that was to offer land to the private rail corporations along the rail track, and in order to get enough money to actually build the rail, they would then sell that land, offer it to people who could purchase it and come and live there. So Roger Launius, who's a US space historian who's investigated this analogy a bit further, points out that that's not really something, that's not a model you can do in space. The Outerspace Treaty forbids private ownership of any part of space. But he says you could offer services in exchange for that kind of model. And he also looks at the tax incentives and other kind of support that state and federal US government gave to the private rail builders in order to get them to invest, to get this infrastructure up and running. Something else was going on here though. Among the people who were disenfranchised by the construction of the railroads were First Nations people who had their land removed from them and had their economies disrupted. So they didn't necessarily gain great benefits out of the construction of this infrastructure. If we move a bit forward in time and a bit closer to home, there's a similar analogy that we could have a look at. So many of you will recognise this, I'm sure many of you have been there. This is the Woomera township where Australia's primary rocket range is located. When it was established in 1947, there was a huge nationwide round of protests which were concerned with the impact that the construction of the range would have on Aboriginal people whose country it was. Some suggested that this could be a fantastic thing for Kukura and Pitjantjatjara and Bangla and other people who live in this region because they would get jobs out of it and training and expertise. And sadly, this isn't what happened. I think there was one fireman who was employed at Woomera, and apart from that, it was Aboriginal women who were drawn into domestic service, as was the pattern in those days. There are some people who argue that in order to carry out lunar and asteroid mining, the investors in those industries will need to have some kind of guarantee that the money they put in will provide them with a return. And the thing I find interesting about this argument is that it's a very bald equation. You put money in order to get something back, and those who put that money in deserve the rewards. What I think is often absolutely unacknowledged is that contributions to the development of space infrastructure are not always financial. Aboriginal people in the Woomera area didn't choose or have control over whether this rocket installation was put on their land, and this is the place where, as Patty said, RESAT-1, Making Us Third in Space, was launched in 1967. So this wasn't their choice. They didn't necessarily get any benefit out of it, but they paid a cost. They contributed to the infrastructure we now have, which was Australia's first space age, and this has happened in a number of different countries. So there's something else to think about in how this infrastructure is developed. This also demonstrates to us that something that's called the digital divide actually starts at that level of how and when that infrastructure to support it is constructed. So in the second period of the space age, where information is the key commodity, it became evident after a while that access to this information and to the hardware and infrastructure that you needed to access it was not evenly divided and did not equally impact people. And this is what was called the digital divide. So there was a huge gap in who could access this information, particularly in the global south and in a number of nations who didn't have the capacity to participate at an equal level. The digital divide also consisted of who created the information. And we know, because people have done studies on this, that the information that was the key commodity was dominated by predominantly white industrial nations, and still is created predominantly by blokes. So this was the problem for the information era. Now, as we've heard, we're moving into the period where the Internet of Things is going to become one of the driving factors of space expansion. This is going to be a different kind of digital divide. People argue that the divide will no longer be in accessing the stuff, it will be in the skills to make use of it and in having the right strategies to effectively use this to increase empowerment and inclusion, as opposed to being disenfranchised and shut out of these new industries. So what else can we do to make sure that that digital divide in the age of the Internet of Things, in the age when wealth is the primary commodity of space enterprise, that large portions of populations or geographic areas or classes of people don't get left behind? So a story of Australian space, which I think illustrates so many nice things about how we can think differently and do things differently, is the one of this little satellite that you see here. This satellite is called Australis Oscar 5. It was planned and designed and constructed by a group of students at Melbourne University and their mates back in the mid-60s. And they had virtually no information to go on, they had virtually no money, they had to borrow things from their engineering mates, they had to just buy things off the shelf at hardware stores. The antennas on this little satellite were actually carpenter's measuring tapes, just bought from the hardware shop. So they made it on the smell of an oily rag. They were part of a US-based amateur radio group whose aim was to launch satellites for radio hams, and this group managed to negotiate a launch for them on a NASA spacecraft. And they were actually building this at the same time RESAT-1, our first satellite, was being built, and there is a little hint that the government wasn't going to be very happy if a group of students got the first Australian satellite in space. So there was a little hint that there was some sabotage. Anyway, they didn't get it launched until 1970, but it's still up there. It's a piece of space junk now. But this is back in the 60s. It was the fifth of these amateur satellites to be launched. It was a little tiny satellite. So this is the origin of the trend we now have to small sats and nanosats. And it's also regular people getting access to space, doing the thing they want to do for the reasons they want to do it. This tradition goes quite deep into space history, and this is part of Australian space history too. And I love this story because it is about the empowerment of regular people. It isn't about the big space corporations, it isn't about the wealthy ones, it's about regular people getting into space. So I've mentioned that lunar and asteroid mining are hot topics at the moment. Countries are passing law, there's 1 million companies and space scientists working on different aspects of how to extract mineral resources from the asteroids or the moon. Everyone wants to go to the moon and from there onto Mars. But we have a bit of an issue with this stuff because there are the Outerspace Treaties, the Moon Agreement and a number of other agreements which basically say you can't own space, you can't own a bit of orbit, you can't own an asteroid, you can't own a bit of the moon, and that if space is the common province of humanity, then all of humanity deserves to share in the profits that come back from that. So there are people who are suggesting that we change those treaties to facilitate the private exploitation of space resources. That may or may not happen, but I think it's inevitable in the next 10, 20 years we're going to have people going to these places to try and extract resources. And because we can't see what they're doing, if they break the law, if they break those treaties, if they do nefarious things, we don't know. I think we should be using the new capabilities we have to develop citizen satellites, to develop ways that we can make sure these private corporations who aren't accountable to us, even if their main clients are governments, that they're doing the things we want them to do. They're using space in the way we think space should be used, hopefully for the betterment of all of humanity and not for particular small portions of it who have that wealth to get into space to begin with. So I'm going to leave you with a final picture. This is also one that probably lots of you have seen. This is a simulation. It shows the Earth surrounded by a cloud of space junk. That large ring you see around the outside, that's the geostationary orbit where all the telecommunications satellites are. This isn't an actual photograph. This is an image constructed out of data, because we'd never see this. We'd never be able to see this. But this is so different, again, to those first two images that I showed you. The Earth is still there, but it's not our focus anymore. Our focus are these white dots. Each one of these is a piece of space junk or a functioning satellite that we're relying on for all of these satellite-based services that are just our everyday life now. And this is a big problem. There's too much of it. Everyone's terrified that something called the Kessler Syndrome will come about, where the rate of collisions creating more bits of space junk is greater than our capacity to remove them. This is what space situational awareness is about. This is the situation we need to be aware of. And something will happen. People are trying to fix this problem. But in the meantime, the Earth is no longer the focus. The focus is the cultural stuff, the material stuff, the technology, the minerals and materials we have moved off Earth into Earth orbit that are creating a new environment, which is the one we're living in, which is the one we have to deal with right now. So Hayes and Lutz, in their theory of space power, argue a final thing about what happens in this space age where wealth is the primary commodity. They think we're also going to have a massive shift of perspective, that our perspective about what's happening in our world will no longer be geocentric. We'll have to look beyond our state. We'll have to look beyond the nation of Australia, beyond the Earth. We will have to look out to the solar system and consider ourselves to be looking at the solar system from a broader perspective. And this change from a geocentric perspective to a solar system perspective is going to be the ultimate thing that takes us into the next space age. Thank you.